Hey, I'm Noam Weissman, and this is Unpacking Israeli History, the podcast that takes a deep dive into some of the most intense, historically fascinating, and often misunderstood events and stories linked to Israeli history. This episode is sponsored by Deborah and Avi Nader and Andrea and Larry Gill. To sponsor an episode of Unpacking Israeli History or just to say what's up, be in touch at noam@unpacked.media. Before we start, as always, check us out on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, all the places. Just search Unpacking Israeli History and hit the follow or subscribe button. It's cool to sometimes see the videos of these things and to see all the images and the B-roll and all those things. So check them out. It's worth it. Okay, yalla, let's do this.
אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל. היא מדינת ישראל.
We, the people of Israel, are prepared and anxious to meet the representatives of our neighbors without any preconditions.
There are people in Israel and elsewhere say it's impossible to make peace between the Arabs and Israel or the Jewish people. I think they are wrong.
If you've been following Unpacking Israeli History for a little while now, you know that I open and close almost every episode with a request to be in touch, to write to me. I love the community aspect of this. And we've now turned a bunch of these emails into Israel open mic episodes where I address your questions directly, explicitly. And I have to tell you, these episodes are some of my favorites. These episodes truly feel like it's a conversation, often about questions that make me say, hey, I wish I'd thought about that. That's exactly how I felt when I got the following email from a listener named Aviva. Hi, Noam. Hey, Aviva. Former New Yorker, current resident of Israel of 5 years. By the way, I love when we have viewers and listeners from Israel. It's awesome. I love that the Israeli community is listening to this podcast and watching it as well. It's awesome. Let me go back to your email. And frequent listener of your superbly entertaining podcast. Oh, thanks, Aviva. Thanks, Aviva. Anyway, she continues. Here's my issue. Oh, you have an issue? What's the issue? What is this Israel has a right to exist phrase? Does any country have a, quote, right to exist? Who's in charge of said right? I'm a Zionist, but I don't think Jews are owed Israel by the world. There's plenty of marginalized people who don't have a nation state. For thousands of years, nations and empires were created and won and existed. Israel was won by people who have had a historical presence and claim, but still won. So why isn't that argument enough? What's this, quote unquote, right? Aviva, I love this question. I love it. I really love it. I'll tell you why. I love it because it highlights a unique dimension of the conversation around Israel. Both Zionists and anti-Zionists talk about Israel's right, quotes, to exist, quote, or lack thereof, seemingly ignoring the obvious fact that it does exist. It does. Guys, it's not theoretical. I literally, and yes, I'm using the term literally correctly, I think I am, just returned from this theoretical place. Just last month, November 2025, I danced at the Western Wall, the Kotel. I walked the streets of Zichron Yaakov. Amazing. By the way, you gotta check that place out. I nearly died at Nachal Me'orot Nature Preserve, hiking up the jagged rocks, holding my 2-year-old with one arm. And I ate so many schnitzel sandwiches for almost every meal. It was out of control. Alarming, yes, especially for my arteries. Worth it? Also, yes, for my taste buds. And this is important. When we talk about Israel's right to exist, we often add in a corollary. We don't just talk about whether the state itself should exist, ignoring the fact that, it does exist. Both Zionists and anti-Zionists talk about its right to exist in its current form as the world's only Jewish state. And there's no better illustration of this phenomenon than the 2025 New York mayoral debate in which Israel somehow became a key topic. After candidate Andrew Cuomo demanded that his fellow candidate Zoran Mamdani affirm Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, here's how Mamdani responded.
I've said time and again that I recognize Israel's right to exist. I've said that I will not recognize any state. I said that I will not.
As a Jewish state.
If I would be allowed to finish,
okay.
That I would not recognize any state's right to exist with a system of hierarchy on the basis of race, of religion.
Seemingly absent from this debate and from the national conversation we've been having for the past 2 years is the fact that Israel already does exist as a Jewish state. But despite multiple wars and intifadas and government collapses and 5 elections in 4 years and a devastating invasion on October 7th, 2023, the country has soldiered on, straddling that line between being a Jewish state and a democratic one. And that's important. Because when some people like Zoran Mamdani talk about Israel's, quote, right to exist, they often follow it up with its right to exist as a democracy. They put conditions on the state's existence, claiming that if it just stopped being so Jewy, so Jewish. If it granted equal rights, in quotes, to everyone, it would be fine. As though the conversation isn't about whether Israel exists, but how it exists. That framing, by the way, is disingenuous. At least, like I like to say when things are my opinion. This is my opinion. Here's why. This state does grant equal rights to its citizens. Non-Jewish citizens vote. They have full access to social services. They serve on the Supreme Court, in the government, in the army. Everything that I'm saying is facts right now. Under the law, they're guaranteed the same right to housing, to education, to healthcare. It's not a perfect bastion of equality. It's not. You know why? Because humans discriminate. Racism exists. Those guaranteed rights don't always materialize. But we don't measure whether states have a right to exist based on whether they are democratic. Mamdani isn't devoting vast amounts of his time and energy of handing down conditions to countries like, say, Egypt or Jordan or Syria or Lebanon, just to name a few, saying their right to exist is dependent on their status as democracies. It's only Israel that gets the litmus test. You deserve to exist only if you meet my specific criteria. Criteria that mandate that Jews not be allowed to have their own state, where they are the majority, where they make the decisions, where they do what's best for them as a people. So you'd be right to wonder, why has the conversation shifted to scrutinizing the country's right when the country is right there? And why is this framing exclusive to Israel and not any other country? Why have Zionists and anti-Zionists alike singled out Israel in this way, made it other, made it different? Even the people who throw down for Israel on social media talk about the Jewish state's right to exist as though the country is theoretical. I don't always agree with New York Times journalist Ezra Klein, but I'm fully on board with his claim that litigating established history isn't just silly, it's unproductive, even obfuscatory. And that's like another way to say obfuscate, but in a fancy way. Here's how he frames it.
It's a question engineered to trap the conversation in the past, rather than to take in the realities of the present. Israel does exist. Israel is a rich nuclear-armed power, with the strongest military in the region by far. It decapitated Hezbollah. It humiliated Iran. What Israel has is more than the right to exist. It has the strength to exist. The Jews who live there have more than the right to self-determination. They have self-determination.
In other words, the question, does Israel have a right to exist as a Jewish state, is fundamentally boring. But Ezra says something else here. Yeah, we're on first-name basis, me and Ezra. And this is what I want to zero in on, which is, what does it even mean for a state to have a right to exist? What does it mean for Israel to exist as a Jewish state? And that, to me, is the crux of the matter. Because what's really on the line in this debate is what it should look like for the Jews to have self-determination. Okay, you asked, what is self-determination? I'm going to go deep in the weeds of nerddom, but stay with me because it's actually significant to everyone listening to and watching to understand what this is all about. Because this is like what everyone's talking about on social and YouTube and every place about the right to exist. So this is what it is. This is the concept of self-determination. It's a modern one. It's not like an ancient thing. It's a modern thing. It started with Enlightenment thinkers who proposed that the legitimacy of a government rests on the consent of the governed. Why does everyone start dozing off when the Enlightenment is mentioned? Like I just see that happening. But here's what happened. The American and French revolutions sharpened that idea. They invoked popular sovereignty, or the idea that political power is vested in and derived from the people. 19th century nationalists in Europe took that idea and ran with it, but added one more dimension: specificity. In other words, every nation, every ethnic group has a specific and unique identity and culture that distinguishes them from everyone else. Meaning, it ain't just about empires anymore. But it wasn't until the early 20th century that this idea crystallized into self-determination, helped along by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, who repeatedly invoked the concept during and after the Great War, which then became known as World War I. His post-World War I peace plan, the 14 Points, was built around the idea that huge multi-ethnic empires were outdone. Yesterday's news. Smaller, self-governing nations based on shared language, culture, and customs were in. So when the United Nations was established after World War II, self-determination became a guiding principle of its charter. So when we talk about Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, what we're really asking is, do Jews have the right to self-determination? If so, what does that look like and how far does that go? So let's start with that first question. Whether Jews specifically have a right to self-determine, to live in a nation based on their common language, customs, culture, history, etc. What does the future look like? But Noam, you're going to say, not all Jews speak Hebrew. Ani ohev iparon. Okay, that's a joke that like maybe 10% of you will get. Not all Jews have the same customs. Not all Jews have the same culture. We're diverse. We're diasporic. And all of that is true, mostly, but all of that kind of misses the point. Things can both be true and miss the point. By the way, see most fights amongst boyfriends and girlfriends or spouses for reference. Because when we talk about self-determination for Jews, what we're really saying is that Jews are a unique and distinct people. Yeah, you could be a Jewish American. You could be Jewish French. You could be Jewish Argentinian. Argentine? Sorry, Latin Americans. I never know how to say it. But being Jewish means being part of a specific people. And that is what I think is difficult for so many people to understand. Judaism is not simply a religion. It's not. It's not grounded only in faith, or even primarily maybe, or in ritual. Though, of course, those things are huge too. There's a peoplehood component to a shared ethnic identity, regardless of whether or not you are American, French, Argentine, or whatever. Why has the chant, "Go back to Poland," been so popular since October 7th? Why are anti-Zionist activists plastering cities with hostage stickers that say, "Bring them home to Europe"? Yep, that's real.
Go back to Poland! Go back to Germany!
Go back to fucking Europe.
None of you are from Israel anyway. Go back to Europe.
The most charitable explanation is that these so-called activists know nothing about Jewish history. That's I think, being charitable. I find it hard to be generous to anyone who sincerely believes that "go back to Poland," pause and think about that, is somehow not hideously offensive, but I'll do my best. You got this, Noam. If you truly believe that Judaism is just a religion or faith, not a nation or tribe, then what's the problem with saying "go back to Poland"? There are Polish Jews, after all. Well, here's the problem with that. First of all, Jews aren't from Poland or Germany or wherever. If we, the Jews, were, Europeans wouldn't have spent roughly 2,000 years murdering, expelling, and oppressing us, forcing us to convert, claiming we drink blood and poison wells. You got it. If Jews were actually Polish, then they wouldn't have been murdered by their neighbors when they returned to their towns in 1946 after the Holocaust. The town of Kielce was once 1/3 Jewish. 1/3. But Nazis murdered the vast majority of its 24,000 Jews. Roughly 200 of these Jews returned after the war, though most were not able to regain any of their property or assets. In July of 1946, a year after the Holocaust ended, a mob of police, soldiers, and civilians in Kielce murdered 42 of these Jews and injured 50 more because a non-Jewish 9-year-old claimed that he missed curfew because the Jews had kidnapped him. No one stopped to investigate or think for a second that maybe this kid was looking for an excuse to avoid getting grounded, or whatever the 1940s Polish equivalent is, for disappearing for hours without permission and making his parents worry. Within hours of this kid making this claim, the mob descended, murdering or injuring nearly 50% of Kielce's Jewish population. So yeah, "go back to Poland" really triggers me, not just because it's offensive, but because it's ahistoric. And this is a history pod, so that's annoying to me. I find it hard to believe that anyone is that ignorant of Jewish history. You don't need to know the history of the Kielce pogrom to know that Europeans have always seen Jews as the other. Of course, they're righteous Gentiles. Of course. But by and large, I think what I just said is pretty accurate. But fine, let's put Poland aside. Let's put them over there. Let's talk about the U.S. instead. You can be proudly and freely Jewish in America, right? Like I am. I'm American, proud to be an American. That's me. I'm proud to be an American. So what exactly do Jews need Israel for? Merely practicing the same religion isn't enough to unite people under a shared banner, right? Remember the 1971 civil war in Pakistan that resulted in the creation of Bangladesh? No, me neither. I wasn't born yet. But I just listened to a really good podcast series about it, and TLDR, the bottom line is that shared religion isn't enough to unite two populations with wildly different identities. And this is what's really interesting. Judaism is not merely a religion. And that, I think, is the root of misunderstanding and inaccurate definition of what Judaism is. And people, by the way, try to be really kind about it. Like when people say I have respect for the Jewish faith, they're missing something. And I want to be clear. Plenty of people, including some Jews, believe that Judaism is nothing more than the Jewish faith. The Mosaic faith is like what it was called. The Jewish faith, that a Jewish person from France and a Jewish person from Australia have no culture in common other than going to the same type of services. And a French Jewish person is represented by the French government, while the Australian Jewish person is represented by Australia. And boom, self-determination. But that's not Judaism. Judaism is not just a religion. It is a people whose history is inextricably linked to a specific piece of land, a people whose religion is largely organized around that land, whether we're marking its agricultural cycles, as we do during Passover and Shavuot. It's a Jewish holiday, I promise you. You could look it up. Or celebrating our right to self-determination in that land as we do during Hanukkah. Whether we're praying thrice daily in that land's direction, whether we're wishing each other next year in Jerusalem at the end of the Seder, whether we're celebrating its fruits as we do during Tu B'Shvat or mourning its destruction as we do during Tisha B'Av. And it is that shared identity and culture that unites us. Whether our grandparents fled Yemen or Poland, it is on that ground that Jewish people, I don't like this word, but deserve self-determination. Meaning it makes sense that Jewish people have self-determination. I'm a Jew, so I say this. We are a people. We are called Am Yisrael all over the place, meaning the nation of Israel. Judaism, yes, is our religion, though how many people practice it? That's a good question within the Jewish people. Jewishness is our ethnic identity, whether we're Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi, Ethiopian, whatever. My friend Tober Hellerstein recently conducted a study entitled American Perceptions of Jews and Israel, Narratives of Anti-Semitism, Insights and Strategies for Change. One of the participants in her study defined Zionism as something awesome. Quote, "It's people fighting for their spot, man. Fighting to live and be able to be free. That's what everybody wants. Fighting for their spot. That is self-determination." But why does self-determination specifically have to mean a Jewish state? Why does it have to mean Israel as it looks now? Well, that's where Jewish history comes in. That's where we start talking about security, about why the only formula that works is a majority Jewish country with a majority Jewish government that looks out for its majority Jewish population. Sounds controversial, but it really shouldn't be. All nations have unique and specific identities. That doesn't mean other cultures and identities aren't welcome. Far from it. And that doesn't mean other cultures and identities are less than or demonized. That doesn't mean exclusion, and it doesn't mean discrimination. It means that countries have a specific character based on their populations. Like Japan is extremely distinct from China, from Korea, from Myanmar. It's majority Japanese with a majority Japanese government that looks out for its majority Japanese population and hopefully its minorities as well. Japanese. Same with European countries like Italy or Finland. Same with African countries like Ethiopia or Senegal. Same with Israel's fellow Middle Eastern countries like Jordan or Qatar or Iran. These are all nations with distinct and non-fungible majority cultures. Some have a national identity stretching back thousands of years, like Japan, like Iran, and like Ethiopia, like Israel. That doesn't mean there's no room for minority cultures within these countries. It doesn't mean these countries are somehow bad. It just means that there's a wider national culture that is set by the majority. And that is what Israel is, the only country in the world where Jews are the majority, where the country is built around our identities, and where we can protect ourselves from threats to our people. Those threats are numerous. They can be existential, like an Iranian nuclear bomb. Israel's existence means having a government that will act to stop that threat as its major goal, like as its priority. Why would any other country have that as a priority, as their priority number one? For Israel, they want to protect their people, the Jewish people, and on all the civilians and citizens. But those threats can also be relatively small. Diaspora annoyances that pile up over time. The constant vandalism of Jewish-owned business in the diaspora isn't an existential threat. It just isn't. I know there are a lot of organizations that it's existential. It's not existential. It might become one. It could, as it did in 1938 Germany or 1940s Egypt. But regardless of whether casual diaspora anti-Semitism is an existential threat, it sucks. Sorry for saying that word. I don't like it. It's not a good word, but yeah, it sucks. It does. It's uncomfortable. And it's really nice to know that there's a place on this earth where that just doesn't exist in the same way, where Jewish people are the majority, where you don't need to explain to your professor what Sukkot is and have her look at you like you need to take off time school to do what now? Heck, it's just nice to be in a place where people can pronounce your name correctly, where people say Noam when people see Noam, like, at Starbucks or something, and say Noam, not Noam, right? Where TV shows tell our stories, refer to our culture in a way that is accurate and true and rich and deep and representative and flattering and not flattering, but spot on. But all that really, it's the cherry on top. Acceptance, belonging, representation, all that fuzzy, warm stuff is nice, but it's not the reason, the raison d'être, the Jewish people have a state. When you get down to brass tacks, Jewish self-determination is largely about security. Yeah, there are lofty goals beyond the security, 100%. To be a light amongst the nations, to be exceptional, to do wonderful things for the world. Security means you're largely about living in a place where your neighbors won't turn on you for being you. History lesson. If history has taught the Jewish people anything, it's that strength can be deceptive, security can be fleeting, and memory, especially the memory of helplessness, is not paranoia but prudence. The Jewish people have a 2,000-year-long record of the fact that bad things happen to stateless Jews. Not just violence, but a negative self-perception that the Jewish people cannot rely on the world's goodwill. We might all be born with innate rights, but that doesn't mean those rights will be recognized. The Nazis did not seem to care about our innate human rights. Neither did the mobs of Egypt and Syria and Iraq and Libya. Members of the Muslim Brotherhood blew up synagogues and muscled Jewish students out of university classrooms in 1940s Cairo with impunity. In 1840 Syria, a century earlier, Jews were accused of kidnapping and killing a Catholic friar and his Muslim servant in order to make matzah out of their blood. No one stopped the arbitrary arrest, torture, forced conversion, or death of the accused men. No one pointed out that, hey, blood is not kosher. No one condemned the kidnapping of 63 Syrian Jewish children, which was meant to make their mothers confess to the crime. In fact, the Times of London published an editorial stating, among other things, the affair is one of the most important cases ever submitted to the notice of the civilized world. Admitting for the moment the accusations to be true, then the Jewish religion must at once disappear from the face of the earth. We shall await the issue as the whole of Europe and the civilized world will do with intense. Oh, sorry, I'm laughing. That wasn't written in the 1340s when the Black Plague was ravaging Europe and the Jews were accused of poisoning all the wells. That was written in 1840. Different accusations, same result, 500 years apart. When Ukrainian Cossacks and peasants rose up against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, they didn't just target Polish nobles. They also massacred between 50 and 30,000 Jews. And I know the numbers range from different historians. In addition to all the awful things that go along with mass slaughter, looting, pillage, rape, mass destruction. I could go on and on about every historical example of Jewish rights, safety, and culture being ignored, dismissed, and trampled. I could talk about university quotas in the USSR and in the United States. I could talk about American hiring practices that explicitly excluded Jews. I could talk about everything from the most minor microaggression to the slaughter of 1 in 3 Jews worldwide between 1939 and 1945. I could talk about the fact that at least 4 Jews have been murdered by so-called anti-Zionist activists in the United States over the past 2 years. I don't mention these murders to scare anyone or to be hyperbolic or to suggest that we're about to experience another Holocaust. No, and no. But I bring this up to remind you that a significant percentage of the world sees Jews as guilty no matter what they do or don't do, which makes it easy to deny my peoplehood, our right to self-rule, our right to security. When Hamas says it wants to destroy Israel, when Iran funds and arms a ring of proxies, when Israeli Jews are targeted and murdered in their beds or slaughtered at a music festival, that is not just a lapse in Israeli intelligence. That is the direct result of a worldview that says Jewish sovereignty is not legitimate. Because Israel's enemies labor under the delusion that they can erase or erode the state, eating away at it with constant attacks, with a nuclear threat, until the whole project seems to be more trouble than it's worth, and that the Jews simply will pack up and leave. But friends, the Jews are not the French, and the Palestinians are not the Algerians. The Jewish people are home. So when we talk about Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, what we're really talking about is the right for Jews to not be murdered in our homes, the right to not be kidnapped into Gaza, the right to not be blown up on the way to school. Michael Koplow, Chief Policy Officer of the Israel Policy Forum and past guest of Unpacking Israeli History, reframes this conversation in a way that I think is clear and smart. He doesn't talk about Israel's right to exist, but Israel's right and obligation to be secure, democratic, and Jewish. And that is what is at stake in this conversation, not whether Israel should exist at all. That ship has sailed, though it took some time for Israel's neighbors to give up on trying to reverse history. Remember, for the first 3 decades of its existence, Israel's neighbors simply refused to recognize that the Jewish country next door was here to stay. They even adopted the famous Khartoum Resolution of 1967, also known as the 3 No's, promising they would never make peace with Israel or recognize Israel or negotiate with Israel. But those days, they're long gone. Egypt and Jordan have signed peace treaties with Israel. The UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan, yes, Sudan, the same country where the Khartoum Resolution was adopted, have normalized relations with the Jewish state. In other words, many of Israel's biggest adversaries opted out of this whole right to exist conversation decades ago and decided to just accept Israel's existence while still criticizing it heavily. And that, to me, is where the conversation needs to start, okay? Not with litigating the past, but with discussing the future. And that means that accepting that the mere existence of the Jewish state is not an automatic threat to the sovereignty and dignity of Palestinians. For many quote-unquote pro-Palestine activists, Israel-Palestine is a zero-sum equation. Israel's existence automatically means that Palestinians are denied their right to sovereignty. And if we take them at their word, if we believe that they're arguing out of good faith, then their formulation can make sense, because if every human has the right to freedom and dignity, and they believe that Israel's existence as a Jewish state threatens the freedom and dignity of many Palestinians, then of course they'll say it has no right to exist. Its existence is impinging on other people's rights. But if a state's quote-unquote right to exist is contingent upon not oppressing others, then why single out Israel specifically? Why only talk about Israel? Why not also say, I believe Peru has a right to exist as a democracy, or I believe Egypt has a right to exist as a democracy? Why focus solely and specifically on Israel? Again, my best faith reading of this take is that pro-Palestine activists believe that while human rights are a universal right, statehood isn't. Following me? Like, as long as people have rights, as long as they're treated equally, they don't necessarily deserve or have the right to their own state. So when someone like Mayor Zoran Mamdani says Israel has a right to exist as a democracy, i.e. not a Jewish state, what he's saying is basically it's fine for Jews to live wherever they want, like live wherever you want, all good. But you're going to be a minority. You'll always be a minority. They don't have the right to be a majority, to live in a country that is culturally and specifically theirs, all of which ignores the fact that Israel is a democracy. Yes, it's flawed. It's flawed. Yeah, it has huge problems. And the situation in the West Bank, Judea, Samaria is extremely complicated and undemocratic in many ways. But 20% of Israeli citizens are not Jewish, and under Israeli law, they have the same rights as anyone else. Casual racism, discrimination, microaggressions, macroaggressions, those exist everywhere, including the Jewish state. But you don't dismantle a country because it doesn't always live up to its stated ideals. I'm not calling for America to be dismantled because Orthodox Jews get beat up on the streets of New York at least once a week, because that would be insane. If we applied this standard to any other country, very few countries, if any, would continue to exist. The Jewish state is an expression of our innate human right to not be casually oppressed, slaughtered, and pushed from polite society. The Jewish state is an expression of our innate human right to not be casually oppressed, slaughtered, and pushed from polite society. It is an insurance policy, a guarantee that there will always be one place we can go when the mob comes to our door. I don't want to be overly lachrymose, but if history teaches us anything, and yes, this is a history podcast, it's that the mob will show up sooner or later. It doesn't matter how good life can seem for Jews. It doesn't matter how powerful or well-connected we are. Jew hatred, or anti-Semitism as it's called in modern parlance, is a condition of history, not an aberration. Yes, it can be diminished, but it's there. It's ontological. It's existential. So Israel has a right to exist because all human beings have a right to freedom and dignity, including Jews. And it is the only place on earth where that right is guaranteed and eternal, no matter what. I love the U.S., and I'm proud to be an American. I would love to trust that this country will always have my back. And I would be naive to believe that the golden age of American Jewry is forever. That's the nature of golden ages. They end. But I want to be very clear about something. For me, fear doesn't mean Israel gets a blank check at all times in the name of protecting Jews. It doesn't. The Israeli scholar Ruth Gaveston said this better than I ever could. And I quote, "If Israel's not a democracy, it has no justification to exist. If Israel's not Jewish, it has no reason to exist." So whether Israel should exist is no longer up for debate. How Israel exists, what it does, how it behaves, that is the real question. That is where the complexity comes in. That is where we should be focusing. That is where we should be aiming our critique. Not at its existence, but at its policies. Because Israel's existence is not contingent on being perfect, just like my existence isn't contingent on me never making a mistake. But its moral backbone relies on the people's behavior, on the decisions that the governments that they elect in make. A right to exist depends on how we exist. If Israel's only concern is rights for Jews at everyone else's expense, guess what? That's not strength. That's not liberation. That's a profound disregard of Israel's moral responsibilities. That's why this right to exist language is so frustrating and so tired. Zionism, it's not just about survival. It's about aspiration. Here's a section from its 1992 Basic Law, which is very roughly analogous to a constitutional amendment to the United States. Quote, "The basic human rights in Israel are based on the recognition of the value of the human being, the sanctity of his life, and his being a free person, and they shall be upheld in the spirit of the principles included in the Declaration of the Establishment of the State of Israel." It goes on in that vein for a while. It never ever differentiates between Jews and non-Jews. The only time the word Jew or Jewish comes up is in context of democracy. Quote, The purpose of this basic law is to protect human dignity and liberty in order to embed the values of the state of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state in a basic law. Jewish and democratic, as in all Israeli citizens have the same right to life, to dignity, to property, to liberty and privacy, as enshrined in this basic law and as stated in the Declaration of Independence. The 2018 nation-state law, passed 26 years later, is controversial, like I said, and it's not the topic of today's episode. But for our purposes, the law does not contradict that combo, Jewish and democratic. Not when it makes Hebrew the official language of the state, guaranteeing, quote, Arabic has a special status in the state. Regulation of the use of Arabic in state institutions or in contacts with them shall be prescribed by law. Nothing in this article shall compromise the status given to the Arabic language in practice before this basic law came into force. Not when it declares, quote, the Sabbath and Jewish holidays are the established days of rest in the state. Those who are not Jewish have the right to keep days of rest on their days of rest and holidays. Details regarding this matter shall be prescribed by law. And not even when it states, quote, the realization of the right to national self-determination in the state of Israel is exclusive to the Jewish people. Because what that means is that the state itself is the only place in the world where Jews and only Jews have the right to define the state's national symbols, public holidays, official language priorities, and collective identity. It still preserves individual civil rights for all citizens, regardless of their identity, voting, political representation, free speech, and equality under other basic laws and Supreme Court precedent. But no one other than the Jewish people has the collective national claim to redefine the state's national character. For example, to abolish its Jewish character, or to make it a single binational state, or to change the name to Palestine, or to change its official languages or state holidays. In other words, the nation-state law simply puts into words what has always been true in practice. Israel is the only country in the world where Yom Kippur and Passover are national holidays, where Jewish history is front and center of the curriculum, where Shabbat is the day of rest, the seventh day, not the sixth day and not the first day, the seventh day. And no one gets to take that away. That is what Zionism is about. That is what Israel is about. Not self-determination at someone else's expense, not trampling Palestinians, not having more rights and resisting equality. But if we want the Jewish state to live up to its promise, we need to stop being afraid of conversations that ask hard questions. If we believe in the Jewish story, if we believe in the Jewish people's resilience, then we should also believe we can have these debates without fear of collapse. Because the right to exist conversation is rarely about philosophy. It's about power. Who has it? Who deserves it? How it's best wielded. That's a conversation worth having. But it must be grounded in reality. And the reality is that the Jewish state of Israel exists. That's the starting point, not the end game. And the sooner we retire this right to exist trope and start talking about how Israel exists, the brighter the future will be. Unpacking Israeli History is a production of Unpacked, an Open Door Media brand. Follow us wherever you get your pods. If you enjoyed this episode, you learned something from it, you appreciated it, you have questions on it, leave us a rating on Apple or Spotify. It really, really, really helps other people find the show. And one more time, I love hearing from you. So email me at noam@unpacked.media. This episode was produced by Rifki Stern. Our team for this episode includes Adi Albaz and Rob Pera. I'm your host, Noam Weissman. Thanks for listening. See you next week.